The dust kicked up by Jake Morrison's boots created small clouds that danced in the harsh Arizona sunlight as he walked toward the trading post. His weathered hat cast a shadow over his blue eyes that had seen too much violence and betrayal in his 32 years of life. The Colt .45 at his hip felt heavier today, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented, a life he was desperate to leave behind. Jake had been running from his past for 3 months now, ever since the incident in Tombstone that left 2 men dead and his reputation in ruins. He wasn't a killer by nature, but sometimes a man had to choose between his life and his conscience. The bounty on his head was growing larger each week, and the Arizona territory was becoming too small to hide in. The trading post sat like a lonely island in the vast desert landscape, its adobe walls baked brown by decades of relentless sun. Smoke curled from the chimney, and Jake could hear the familiar sounds of commerce. Voices haggling, coins jingling, and the creak of leather goods being examined. This was neutral ground, a place where cowboys, ranchers, drifters, and even Apache traders could conduct business without the usual tensions that plagued the frontier. As Jake pushed through the heavy wooden door, a bell announced his arrival. The interior was dimly lit, filled with the smells of tobacco, leather, and coffee. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with everything from ammunition to preserves, from blankets to bottles of whiskey. Behind the counter stood Samuel Hayes, a grizzled man whose beard was more gray than black, and whose eyes had learned to size up a customer within seconds. "Jake Morrison," Samuel said with a nod. "Didn't expect to see you this far south. Just passing through, Sam. Need supplies for a long journey." Samuel's eyes narrowed slightly. He knew about the bounty, of course. News traveled fast in the territory, especially bad news about wanted men. But Samuel had always been fair in his dealings, treating all customers with equal respect as long as they paid their bills and kept the peace inside his establishment. "Where you heading?" Samuel asked, though Jake suspected he already knew the answer. "Mexico. Figure it's time for a change of scenery." As Jake moved through the store, selecting jerky, hardtack, and ammunition, he became aware of another presence. In the corner, examining a selection of knives, stood a woman unlike any he had ever seen. She was Apache. That much was clear from her clothing and the way she carried herself, with quiet dignity. Her long black hair was braided with small silver ornaments that caught the light when she moved. Her buckskin dress was decorated with intricate beadwork, and her moccasins made no sound on the wooden floor. What struck Jake most was not her obvious beauty, but the intelligence in her dark eyes and the way she seemed completely at ease in this world of white traders and cowboys. Most Apache women he had encountered in his travels stayed close to their own people, avoiding contact with whites except when absolutely necessary. This woman seemed different, confident and unafraid. Their eyes met across the store, and Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in years, genuine curiosity about another person. She held his gaze for a moment, then returned her attention to the knives, selecting one with a carved bone handle and testing its balance with practiced skill. "That's Ayanna," Samuel said quietly, having noticed Jake's interest. "She comes here regular-like, trading goods from her people. Makes the finest beadwork and leather goods you'll find in the territory." "She married?" Samuel chuckled. "Now that's an interesting question." "Ayanna chooses her own path, if you catch my meaning. Her father was a respected warrior, and she inherited his independent spirit. She's turned down more marriage proposals than you could count, both from Apache braves and white men who thought they could tame her." Jake continued shopping, but found himself stealing glances at the woman called Ayanna. She moved with purpose, clearly knowing exactly what she needed and unwilling to be rushed or influenced by others. When she approached the counter to conduct her business, Jake noticed that Samuel treated her with obvious respect, speaking to her in a mixture of English and what Jake assumed was Apache. "The beadwork you ordered is ready," Samuel told her, producing a beautifully decorated vest from behind the counter. "Mrs. Patterson in Tucson will be mighty pleased with this." Ayanna examined the vest carefully, running her fingers over the intricate patterns. Jake could see that each bead had been placed with extraordinary precision, creating designs that seemed to tell a story. The colors flowed together like a sunset, and the craftsmanship was unlike anything he had seen. "She pays well for quality work," Ayana said, her English perfect but touched with an accent that made each word sound musical. "I will have more pieces ready next month." As she concluded her business, Jake found himself moving closer to the counter. He wasn't sure what he intended to say or do, but something about this woman compelled him to take action. Maybe it was the way she carried herself with such confidence, or maybe it was simply that she represented everything his current life was not: peaceful, purposeful, and free from the violence that seemed to follow him everywhere. "Excuse me," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "That's beautiful work you do." Ayana turned to face him fully for the first time, and Jake felt the full weight of her attention. Her dark eyes seemed to look right through him, as if she could read the story of his life written in the lines around his eyes and the calluses on his hands. "Thank you," she said simply. "You are the one they call Jake Morrison." It wasn't a question, and Jake felt a chill run down his spine. If an Apache woman trading at a remote post knew his name, then his reputation had spread farther than he had imagined. He waited for her to say something about the bounty, or to show fear, but she did neither. "I am," he admitted. "You are running. Again." It wasn't a question. Jake glanced around the store, suddenly aware that their conversation might be overheard, but Samuel had discreetly moved to the back room, and they were alone. "A man does what he has to do," Jake said carefully. Ayana studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, to his complete surprise, she smiled. It was a small smile, but it transformed her entire face, making her seem younger and somehow more approachable. "Running from others or running from yourself?" she asked. The question hit Jake like a physical blow. In all his months of fleeing bounty hunters and avoiding towns where his face might be recognized, no one had asked him that. Most people saw only the surface, a wanted man with blood on his hands and a price on his head. But this Apache woman had somehow seen deeper, to the part of him that was tired of violence and longing for something different. "Both, I reckon," he answered honestly. Ayana nodded as if this was the answer she had expected. She gathered her purchases, securing them in a leather bag that looked handmade and incredibly durable. Jake watched her movements, noting the efficiency and grace with which she handled even simple tasks. "There is a place," she said quietly, so quietly that Jake had to lean closer to hear her words, "far from the trading routes, where a man might find peace if he truly seeks it." Jake's heart began to beat faster. Was she offering him sanctuary? It seemed impossible that this woman, who barely knew him, would extend such trust to a wanted man. But something in her voice suggested she was serious. "Why would you tell me this?" he asked. Ayana paused in her packing and looked at him again with those penetrating dark eyes. "Because I have watched you since you entered this place. You are not like the others who come here with violence in their hearts and cruelty in their actions. Your spirit is wounded, but it is not evil. You don't know what I've done. I know enough. I know that you have not looked at me as many white men do, as something to be possessed or conquered. I know that you speak to Samuel with respect, though he is only a traitor. I know that your hand has not moved toward your weapon even once since entering this place, though you have clearly learned to be cautious." Jake was amazed by her observations. In the short time he had been in the store, she had read him more accurately than people who had known him for years. It was both unsettling and oddly comforting to be truly seen by another human being. "This place you mentioned," he said carefully, "would it be safe for someone like me?" "It would be safe for someone seeking to leave his old life behind and build something new. It would not be safe for someone who cannot let go of violence and anger." The challenge in her words was clear. She was offering him a chance, but only if he was truly ready to change. Jake thought about the life he had been living, always looking over his shoulder, sleeping with one eye open, trusting no one. The loneliness had become almost unbearable, and the constant tension was wearing him down both physically and mentally. "I'm tired," he admitted. "Tired of running, tired of fighting, tired of being alone." Something shifted in Ayana's expression, a softening that suggested his words had touched something in her own experience. Loneliness is a heavy burden, she agreed, but it need not be a permanent one. She finished securing her bag and slung it over her shoulder with practiced ease. Jake realized that she was preparing to leave, and panic shot through him. This conversation felt like the most important one he had had in months, perhaps years, and he wasn't ready for it to end. When? He asked urgently. When could I if I decided to? 3 days, she said. Ride north from here until you reach the red rocks that look like sleeping giants. Wait there at sunset. If you come alone, and come unarmed except for hunting weapons. The conditions surprised Jake. Asking a wanted man to give up his guns was asking him to put his life completely in her hands. It was a test of trust that few people would be willing to make. And if I don't come, then you are not ready, and our paths were not meant to cross again. With that, she moved toward the door. Jake watched her go, torn between following her and staying rooted to the spot. At the threshold, she paused and turned back. Jake Morrison, she said, and hearing his name spoken in her musical voice sent another chill through him. The life you have been living, it is not the only life possible for you. Then she was gone, disappearing into the bright sunlight like a vision. Jake stood staring at the empty doorway, his mind racing. Samuel emerged from the back room, giving Jake a curious look. Interesting conversation? The older man asked. You could say that. Ayana doesn't talk to many white men. Matter of fact, I've never seen her have a conversation that long with anyone except her own people. What do you know about her? Samuel leaned against the counter, clearly settling in for a longer discussion. Her Apache name means eternal blossom, which fits her pretty well. Her father was a war chief, respected even by his enemies. She learned to fight, hunt, and survive just like any Apache warrior. But she also learned the women's arts: beadwork, weaving, healing. She said she's had marriage proposals, more than you could count. Apache braves want her because she's beautiful and skilled. White men want her because they're fools who think they can own something like her, but Ayana has never shown interest in any of them. Jake mulled this over as he completed his purchases. The idea that this remarkable woman had spoken to him, offered him something, when she had apparently rejected so many others, was both thrilling and terrifying. Sam, he said as he paid for his supplies, if a man wanted to change his life, really change it, what would you say his chances were? The older man looked at him carefully. Depends on the man and how badly he wants to change. Some folks are too set in their ways, too comfortable with being miserable. Others might surprise themselves if they found the right reason to try. And if that man was wanted by the law, then he'd better hope he found someone willing to see past what he's done to what he might become. Jake nodded, understanding the implicit message. He gathered his supplies and headed for the door, his mind made up. He had 3 days to prepare for what might be the most important decision of his life. As he stepped back into the blazing Arizona sun, Jake Morrison looked north toward the distant red rocks and wondered if redemption was really possible for a man like him. The weight of his gun seemed heavier than ever, but for the first time in months, he felt something other than despair. He felt hope. The 3 days passed like a lifetime for Jake Morrison. He made camp 20 miles from the trading post, far enough to avoid unwanted attention, but close enough to reach the red rocks by the appointed time. Each day brought the same internal struggle. Should he trust this Apache woman who had appeared in his life like a desert mirage? Or should he continue running south toward Mexico and the uncertain safety it might provide? On the second night, as he sat beside his small campfire staring up at the star-filled sky, Jake found himself thinking about Ayana's words. The life you have been living, it is not the only life possible for you. The phrase echoed in his mind, challenging everything he had come to believe about his future. For months he had seen only 2 options: keep running until the bounty hunters finally caught up with him, or die in a gunfight trying to protect himself. The idea that there might be a third path seemed too good to be true. He spent hours cleaning and oiling his weapons, a habit that had kept him alive through countless dangerous situations. The familiar ritual was soothing, but tonight it felt different. If he kept his appointment with Ayana, he would have to leave these guns behind. The thought terrified him. Without his weapons, he would be defenseless against anyone who recognized him. But with them, he would never truly be free from the violence that had defined his life for so long. By the morning of the third day, Jake had made his decision. He would go to the Red Rocks. He would trust this remarkable woman who had seen something in him that he could barely see in himself. If it was a trap, if she had betrayed him to bounty hunters, at least he would die trying to change rather than simply running away from his problems. The Red Rocks were exactly as Ayana had described. Massive formations of sandstone that rose from the desert floor like sleeping giants. The late afternoon sun painted them in shades of crimson and gold, creating a landscape so beautiful that Jake found himself stopping his horse just to stare. He had spent so many months focused on survival that he had forgotten to notice the world around him. Now faced with this natural cathedral of stone and sky, he felt a stirring of something he had thought was dead inside him: wonder. He made camp at the base of the largest formation and waited. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Jake heard the soft sound of approaching horses. His hand moved instinctively toward his gun, then stopped. He had promised to come unarmed except for hunting weapons. His rifle and bow were secured to his saddle, but his Colt .45 lay wrapped in his bedroll, a symbolic gesture of trust that felt both liberating and terrifying. Ayana appeared first, riding a paint horse with the easy grace of someone who had learned to ride before she could walk. She was followed by 2 Apache men, both young and clearly warriors by their bearing and the weapons they carried. Jake's muscles tensed involuntarily, but he forced himself to remain calm. If Ayana had wanted him dead, there were easier ways to accomplish it than luring him to this remote location. She dismounted and approached him with the same confident stride he remembered from the trading post. Today, she wore different clothes, practical riding gear that still showed the intricate beadwork and attention to detail that marked all her possessions. Her long hair was braided back, and Jake noticed a small scar on her left temple that he hadn't seen before. "You came," she said, and there was something in her voice that suggested she hadn't been entirely certain he would. "I keep my word. As do I." She gestured toward the 2 men who had accompanied her. "These are my brothers, Nalnish and Tsehe. They wanted to see the white man their sister has chosen to help." The word chosen hit Jake like a physical blow. It implied a level of deliberation and commitment that made this encounter far more significant than a casual offer of help to a stranger. He studied the 2 Apache warriors, noting the way they watched him with eyes that missed nothing. Neither seemed hostile, but Jake had no doubt that they would kill him without hesitation if they perceived him as a threat to their sister. "Brothers?" Jake said, inclining his head respectfully. He had learned enough about Apache culture during his time in the territory to know that showing proper respect to family members was crucial. Nalanish, the older of the 2, stepped forward. "Our sister says you wish to leave the white man's violence behind. Is this true?" "It is. And yet you have lived by violence for many years. Why should we believe you can change?" It was a fair question, and Jake appreciated the directness with which it was asked. These people didn't waste time on pleasantries or indirect communication. They wanted to know who he was and what his intentions were. "Because I'm tired," Jake answered honestly. "Tired in ways that sleep can't fix. The life I've been living, it's eating me alive from the inside out. If I don't change, I'm going to die, maybe from a bullet, maybe from just giving up. Either way, I'll be dead." Tessé, the younger brother, spoke for the first time. "Many men grow tired of violence, but few have the strength to truly leave it behind. What makes you different?" Jake thought about the question carefully before answering. It was the same question he had been asking himself for 3 days. "I don't know if I am different," he admitted. "I only know that when your sister looked at me in that trading post, she saw something I'd forgotten was there. Maybe she was wrong, but I have to find out. Because if she wasn't wrong, if there really is something worth saving in me, then I owe it to myself and to everyone who's suffered because of my actions to try." Ayana had been silent during this exchange, but now she stepped closer to Jake. "Show them," she said quietly. Jake understood what she meant. He walked to his horse and unwrapped his gun belt from his bedroll. The weight of it in his hands brought back a flood of memories. Some good, many bad. This weapon had saved his life more times than he could count, but it had also taken lives and bound him to a cycle of violence that seemed impossible to escape. Without ceremony, he walked to a nearby boulder and placed the gun belt on top of it. Then he stepped back, leaving his most trusted protection behind. The gesture had a profound effect on the Apache brothers. Jake could see the surprise in their eyes, followed by something that might have been respect. Even for warriors accustomed to acts of courage, deliberately disarming oneself in the presence of strangers was a significant gesture. "You understand," Nalnish said slowly, "that once you walk this path with us, there is no going back to your old life. If you change your mind later, if you decide that peace is too difficult, you cannot return to violence and expect our protection to continue." "I understand. And you understand that our people have suffered much at the hands of white men. Trust does not come easily to us. I wouldn't expect it to." Ayana moved to stand beside her brothers, and for a moment the three of them conversed in rapid Apache. Jake caught a few words that he recognized, but the conversation was far too fast and complex for him to follow. He waited, trying to project calm confidence while his heart pounded in his chest. Finally, Ayana turned back to him. "My brothers will return to our people and speak of what they have seen here. If the council agrees, you will be welcome in our hidden valley. But first, you must prove that you can live as we do, in harmony with the land and with yourself." "What do you mean?" "You will come with me to a sacred place, a place of healing and vision. You will spend time there alone, without weapons, without the comforts of white man's civilization. You will learn to listen to the voice of the earth and the voice of your own spirit. Only when you have found peace within yourself can you hope to live peacefully with others." The proposal was both appealing and terrifying. Jake had spent so many years surrounded by noise and violence that the idea of true solitude was foreign to him. But there was something in Ayana's words that resonated deeply, a promise of the kind of inner peace he had never known. "How long?" he asked. "As long as it takes. Some men find what they seek in a few days. Others take weeks. A few never find it at all and must return to their old ways. And if I fail, then you will return to this place, collect your weapons and ride away. We will not pursue you or reveal your location to others. But neither will you be welcome among our people." Jake nodded slowly. It was a fair offer, more generous than anything he had a right to expect from people who had every reason to distrust him. "I'll do it," he said. Ayana smiled, and again Jake was struck by how that simple expression transformed her entire face. "I hoped you would say that." Nalnish and Say prepared to leave, but before mounting their horses, they each approached Jake. Nalnish clasped his shoulder briefly, a gesture that conveyed acknowledgement if not yet full acceptance. Batess was more reserved, but offered a slight nod that Jake interpreted as encouragement. "Take care of our sister," Nalnish said. "She has risked much by bringing you into our world." After her brothers departed, Ayana began preparing for their own journey. She moved with efficient purpose, checking her supplies and adjusting her horse's gear. Jake watched her, still amazed by the turn his life had taken. 3 days ago, he had been a fugitive with no hope for the future. Now he was preparing to embark on a spiritual quest with an Apache woman who had somehow seen past his violent reputation to something worth saving. "Where are we going?" he asked as he secured his own gear, leaving the gun belt where he had placed it on the boulder. "To a place my people call the heart of the mountain. It is a canyon hidden deep in the high country, where the spirits speak clearly to those who know how to listen." As they rode away from the red rocks, Jake felt as if he was leaving more than just his weapons behind. The man who had walked into that trading post 3 days ago, angry, desperate, and alone, was fading away like smoke in the desert wind. In his place was emerging someone new, someone whose future was unwritten and full of possibility. The trail Ayana led him on was unlike any he had traveled before. Instead of following established routes used by settlers and military patrols, she chose paths that seemed to exist only for those who knew how to read the subtle signs in the landscape. They climbed steadily into higher country, leaving the desert floor behind for rolling hills covered in juniper and pine. As they rode, Ayana began to teach him things he had never considered important. She showed him how to read the wind patterns that indicated weather changes, how to identify plants that could provide food or medicine, how to move through the landscape without disturbing its natural rhythms. For a man accustomed to imposing his will on his environment through force, these lessons required a fundamental shift in thinking. "Your people," she said, as they paused to rest the horses beside a clear stream. "They see the land as something to be conquered, controlled, possessed. My people understand that we are part of the land, no more important than the deer or the eagle or the smallest flower." Jake knelt by the stream and cupped the cold water in his hands, drinking deeply. The simple act felt almost ceremonial after Ayana's words. "I never thought about it that way," he admitted, "because you have been taught to think of yourself as separate from everything around you. But separation is an illusion. Everything is connected. The water that flows in this stream also flows in your veins. The air that fills your lungs has been breathed by every living thing. When you understand this, truly understand it, violence becomes impossible." They made camp that night in a grove of ancient cottonwoods whose leaves whispered secrets in the evening breeze. Jake had expected the absence of his weapons to make him feel vulnerable, but instead he felt oddly free. Without the constant weight of his gun belt, without the need to constantly scan for threats, he found himself noticing things that had been invisible to him before. The intricate patterns of bark on the trees, the way the last sunlight turned the stream into liquid gold, the dozens of different bird songs that created a symphony in the growing darkness. Ayana prepared a simple meal of cornbread and jerky, supplemented with edible plants she had gathered along the trail. As they ate, she began to tell him about her people's history, about the sacred places they had been forced to abandon, about the warriors who had died fighting to protect their way of life. "My father," she said as the fire crackled between them, "was one of the last great war chiefs. He fought against the Mexican soldiers, against the American army, against anyone who tried to force our people onto the reservations. But in his final years, he came to understand that the old ways of fighting would only lead to our destruction." What changed his mind? He saw the future in a vision. He saw that the white man's numbers would grow like grass after rain, that resistance through violence would only bring more violence. He saw that survival would require adaptation, learning to live in two worlds while keeping the heart of our own culture alive. Jake stirred the fire with a stick, sending sparks dancing up toward the stars. "Is that why you help someone like me? To build bridges between our peoples?" Ayana considered the question carefully before answering. "Partly, but also because I believe that healing is possible, for individuals and for peoples. You carry wounds that run deeper than the scars on your hands. My people carry wounds that run deeper than the scars on our land. Perhaps by healing together we can learn things that neither of us could discover alone." That night, Jake slept more deeply than he had in months. Without the weight of his weapons and the constant vigilance they represented, his body finally allowed itself to truly rest. He dreamed of soaring over vast landscapes like an eagle, seeing the world spread out below him in all its interconnected complexity. When he woke, Ayana was already preparing for the day's journey. The final push to the heart of the mountain would be the most challenging, requiring them to leave the horses behind and travel on foot through terrain that few white men had ever seen. "Are you ready?" she asked, shouldering her pack. Jake looked back down the trail they had climbed, seeing the path that led back to his old life growing fainter with distance. Then he looked ahead, toward the unknown peaks that held his future. "I'm ready," he said, and for the first time in years he truly meant it. The heart of the mountain revealed itself to Jake Morrison like a secret whispered by the earth itself. After 3 days of climbing through increasingly rugged terrain, following paths that seemed to exist more in Ayana's memory than in the physical world, they emerged from a narrow canyon into a hidden valley that took his breath away. Towering walls of red and gold stone rose on all sides, creating a natural amphitheater that seemed designed by the gods themselves. A waterfall cascaded from an impossible height, feeding a crystal-clear pool that reflected the sky like a mirror. Ancient petroglyphs covered the rock faces, telling stories that stretched back thousands of years. The air itself felt different here, thinner, cleaner, charged with an energy that made every breath feel sacred. "This is where you will stay," Ayana said, setting down her pack beside the pool. "This is where you will learn who you truly are beneath all the anger and fear and violence." Jake walked slowly around the perimeter of the valley, his footsteps echoing softly off the stone walls. The place felt alive in ways that he couldn't explain, as if the rocks themselves were watching him, measuring his worthiness to be in this sacred space. "How long do I stay?" he asked. "Until you know," Ayana replied. Some find their answers quickly, others must struggle longer with the voices from their past. The spirits will tell you when you are ready to leave. She showed him a small cave where he could shelter if the weather turned bad, and a grove of piñon pines where he could gather nuts if his provisions ran low. There were fish in the pool, and she taught him to catch them with his bare hands in the Apache way. But mostly, she explained, he would need to learn to be still, to listen to the silence that spoke louder than any human voice. "What am I supposed to do here?" Jake asked as she prepared to leave him alone. "Nothing," she said with a smile. "That is the hardest lesson for white men to learn, the power of doing nothing, of simply being present in the moment without trying to control or change anything." As evening approached, Ayana gathered her things and prepared for the journey back down the mountain. Jake felt panic rising in his chest at the thought of being left alone in this remote place, cut off from everything familiar. But when he looked into her dark eyes, he saw confidence and trust that calmed his fears. "You will not abandon me here?" he asked, hating the vulnerability in his voice. "I will return in 7 days. If you are ready then, we will go together to my people. If you are not ready, I will bring more supplies and return again in another 7 days. I will continue to return until you find what you seek, or until you decide that this path is not for you." She mounted her horse and looked down at him one final time. "Remember, Jake Morrison, you are not the same man who entered Samuel's trading post. You have already begun to change. Trust in that change and let it guide you." Then she was gone, disappearing back into the canyon as silently as she had appeared, leaving Jake alone with his thoughts and the whisper of wind through ancient stone. The first night was the hardest. Without weapons, without the familiar sounds of civilization, without even the company of his horse, Jake felt more alone than he ever had in his life. Every shadow seemed to hide potential threats. Every sound made him reach for guns that were no longer there. He barely slept, starting awake at the slightest noise, his heart pounding with irrational fear. But as the days passed, something began to shift inside him. Gradually, the silence stopped feeling oppressive and began to feel welcoming. The absence of human noise allowed him to hear things he had never noticed before, the subtle differences between the calls of various birds, the rhythm of water flowing over stone, the whisper of wind through different types of vegetation. By the third day, Jake found himself sitting motionless for hours at a time, simply watching the play of light and shadow on the canyon walls as the sun moved across the sky. It was during one of these periods of quiet observation that he began to see the first of what he would later think of as visions. It started as a reflection in the pool, not his own face looking back at him, but the face of a young boy. Jake recognized himself at age 12. Before his father's death had sent his life spinning into violence and desperation, the boy in the water looked up at him with eyes full of hope and innocence, eyes that still believed the world was essentially good and that people could be trusted. "What happened to you?" the boy seemed to ask. Jake found himself speaking aloud to the reflection, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "I got angry," he said. "Someone killed Pa, and I got so angry I couldn't see straight. I let that anger guide me for 20 years, and it led me to places I never wanted to go." "But anger isn't who you are," the boy replied. "It's just something that happened to you." The conversation continued for what felt like hours, Jake pouring out 20 years of accumulated pain and rage to this younger version of himself. As he spoke, he felt something loosening inside his chest, like a knot that had been pulled tight for so long that he had forgotten it was there. On the 5th day, Jake encountered his father in a dream that felt more real than waking life. Thomas Morrison appeared as Jake remembered him. Weathered hands, kind eyes, and a gentle way of speaking that had made every word feel important. "Son," his father said, sitting beside Jake on a boulder that hadn't been there when he went to sleep, "you've been carrying my death like a curse all these years." "But they killed you," Jake protested. "They shot you down in the street like a dog, and nobody paid for it." "And what good did your revenge do? Did it bring me back? Did it heal your pain? Or did it just create more pain, spreading out like ripples in a pond, until it touched the lives of people who had nothing to do with my death?" Jake had no answer for that. His quest for vengeance had indeed spread suffering far beyond the men who had killed his father. Innocent people had been hurt, lives had been destroyed, and the cycle of violence had continued to grow. "I don't know how to let it go," Jake admitted. "I've been angry for so long, I don't know who I am without it." "You're my son," Thomas Morrison said with infinite gentleness. "You're the boy who used to help me with the horses, who worried about injured animals, who cried when we had to put down a sick calf." "That boy is still in there, Jake. He's been waiting 20 years for you to remember him." When Jake woke from the dream, his face was wet with tears he didn't remember shedding. But the crushing weight that had sat on his chest for 2 decades felt lighter somehow, as if some essential poison had been drained away. The 6th day brought a different kind of vision, a glimpse of a possible future. Jake saw himself working with his hands again, but not with weapons. He was building something, creating rather than destroying. There were children around him, and a woman with dark hair and wise eyes who watched him with love and pride. The scene felt so real, so possible, that when it faded, he was left with an almost overwhelming sense of hope. On the 7th day, as promised, Ayanna returned. Jake heard her horse long before he saw her, but instead of the anxiety he might have felt a week earlier, he experienced only quiet anticipation. When she emerged from the canyon leading her paint horse, she stopped and studied him carefully. "You look different," she observed. Jake considered this. He felt different, lighter somehow, as if he had been carrying a heavy pack for so long that he had forgotten what it was like to walk without that burden. "I feel different," he said. "I feel clean." Ayanna nodded approvingly. "Tell me what you learned." Jake sat beside the pool where he had spent so many hours in contemplation. "I learned that I've been living someone else's story for 20 years. When my father was killed, I let other people's evil define who I became. I let their violence turn me into something I never wanted to be. And who do you want to be? I want to be the man my father raised me to be. I want to build instead of destroy. I want to protect instead of hunt. I want to love instead of hate." He paused, looking up at her with eyes that were clearer than they had been in decades. "I want to earn the trust you've shown in me." Ayanna smiled, and Jake felt his heart skip in his chest. "Then you are ready to meet my people." The journey to the Apache settlement took 2 more days of careful travel through hidden paths and secret valleys. As they rode, Jake found himself seeing the landscape through new eyes, where once he had seen only obstacles to overcome or resources to exploit. Now he saw a living system of incredible complexity and beauty. Every plant, every animal, every geological formation was part of an intricate web of relationships that had taken millennia to develop. "Your people," he said to Ayanna as they paused to rest on a high ridge. "They understand something that mine have forgotten." "What is that?" "That we're guests here, not masters. That the land doesn't belong to us. We belong to the land." The Apache settlement was hidden in a valley so well concealed that Jake would have ridden past it a dozen times without seeing it. Adobe buildings seemed to grow from the red earth itself, their lines flowing naturally with the contours of the landscape. Gardens flourished in terraced plots, watered by an ingenious system of channels that directed runoff from the surrounding hills. Children played in dusty courtyards while women worked at looms and men crafted tools and weapons with patient skill. Jake's arrival caused a stir of interest and some obvious concern. These people had learned to be wary of white strangers, and his presence represented a risk to their carefully guarded security. But Ayanna spoke to several of the elders in rapid Apache, and gradually the tension began to ease. Nalish and C emerged from one of the larger buildings, approaching Jake with expressions that were neutral but not hostile. Behind them came an elderly man, whose bearing and the respect shown to him by others marked him as someone of great importance. "This is my grandfather," Ayanna said. "He is the one who must decide if you are welcome here." The old man studied Jake with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the authority of decades of leadership. "My granddaughter says you have left your old life behind. But words are easy, and change is hard. How do we know that you will not bring danger to our people?" It was the question Jake had been expecting, and one he had thought about extensively during his time in the canyon. "You don't know," he said honestly. "You can't know for certain, just as I can't promise that I'll never face temptation to return to my old ways. All I can offer is my word that I will do everything in my power to earn your trust and prove that your granddaughter's faith in me is justified." The old man nodded slowly. "At least you speak truth instead of empty promises. That is a good beginning." Over the following days, Jake began to learn what life among the Apache truly meant. It wasn't just about adopting their customs or learning their skills. It was about fundamentally changing his relationship with the world around him. Everything was interconnected, from the way food was grown and prepared to the way decisions were made and conflicts resolved. He worked alongside the men, learning to craft tools and weapons in the traditional way. He learned that every arrow had to be perfect, not just because someone's life might depend on it, but because creating something with care and attention was itself a form of prayer. He discovered that hunting wasn't about dominance over nature, but about participating in the ancient cycle of life and death that sustained all things. But it was his relationship with Ayanna that proved to be the most transformative element of his new life. What had begun as gratitude and attraction gradually deepened into something neither of them had expected. A love built not on possession or need, but on mutual respect and shared vision. One evening, as they sat together watching the sunset paint the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson, Ayanna spoke about her own journey. "I have always been different from other women of my people," she said. "They wanted marriage and children and the security of traditional life. I wanted to explore, to learn, to build bridges between worlds. My father worried that I would never find happiness." "Are you happy?" Jake asked. She turned to look at him, her dark eyes reflecting the last light of day. "For the first time in my life, I am complete. When I saw you in Samuel's trading post, I recognized something. A fellow traveler, someone else searching for meaning beyond the narrow roles our peoples have created for us." Jake reached for her hand, marveling at how natural the gesture felt. "I never believed in fate before. But meeting you, it feels like everything that happened in my life, all the pain and mistakes and violence, somehow led me to that moment when you chose to see something worth saving in me." 6 months later, Jake Morrison married Ayanna in a ceremony that blended Apache traditions with rituals they created themselves. The wedding took place in the heart of the mountain, where Jake had found his true self in solitude and silence. Samuel Hayes came to witness the ceremony, bringing gifts and his own testament to the changes he had seen in Jake. "I've known a lot of men in my time," the old trader said as he clasped Jake's hand, "but I've never seen anyone change as completely as you have. Whatever Ayanna showed you up in those mountains, it transformed you into someone completely different." Jake looked around at the faces surrounding him. Apache families who had welcomed him as one of their own. Ayanna's grandfather who had become a second father to him. Children who ran to him with the truly innocent could offer. This was his family now, his people, his home. "She showed me that redemption is possible," Jake said. "That no matter how far you've fallen, there's always a path back to who you were meant to be. You just have to be brave enough to take the first step." As the sun set over the sacred valley, Jake Morrison, former gunfighter, outlaw, and wanted man, stood with his wife among people who had learned to see past the surface to the true heart of things. The weapons he had abandoned at the Red Rocks were rusting away in the desert, but the man who had carried them had been reborn. When Ayana had chosen him in that dusty trading post, she had seen something that even he hadn't known existed: the possibility of transformation, the potential for a love that could bridge worlds, and the truth that every person, no matter how lost they might seem, carries within them the seeds of redemption. His response to her choice had indeed changed everything, not just for him but for everyone whose life he touched from that day forward. And in the years that followed, as he and Ayana raised children who belonged to both worlds and neither, Jake would often reflect on the miraculous truth that the greatest courage isn't found in facing down enemies with guns blazing, but in laying down those guns and choosing to become someone worthy of the trust and love that others offer. The Apache woman had chosen him, and in learning to be worthy of that choice, Jake Morrison had finally chosen himself.